I speak of things that were already old when poets first set them into verse. I did not see them with living eyes, but I have carried the telling long enough that the edges have worn smooth. This is how such stories survive, not as inventions, but as weight passed from voice to voice, warmed by breath, worn down by repetition, until what remains is the part that will not break. If you listen the right way, you can feel where the weight sits. It settles in the same places each time, in a name spoken softly, in a door that should not open, in a single sentence that becomes a law. So come closer and let the rest of the room fade. This story does not need bright attention. It needs the quiet kind, the kind you give to firelight, or to rain at the window, or to someone speaking low so the night does not fully empty. Orpheus was known before sorrow knew him, not only among men, but among hills and rivers, among paths that had felt his footsteps often enough to recognize them. He was born in Thrace, where the land is hard and the wind speaks plainly, where winter does not ask permission, and the earth remembers every step that presses into it. His mother was Calliope, first among the muses, keeper of memory and song, not memory as a record, but memory as a living thing, carried in breath and sound, kept alive only as long as someone dares to speak it. His father, some said, was Eurydice, a king among men. Others named Apollo himself. The old mouths never agreed on that, but they agreed on what mattered. The music did not come from practice alone. It was given the way fire is given, the way a spring breaks from stone. When Orpheus played the lyre, his bright gold-toned kithara, as some remember it, stones shifted where they lay, not hurriedly, not as if compelled, but as if they had been waiting for the right sound to remind them how to move. Trees bent their roots and followed, not tearing themselves free in violence, but loosening gently, as if the ground itself permitted it. Rivers slowed their courses, their surfaces smoothing, their currents easing, listening as though the song named them correctly for the first time. Wild beasts forgot their hunger and stood as if tamed, not by command, not by fear, but by attention. This is not metaphor in the old accounts. It is stated as fact, as plainly as one states the rising of the sun or the falling of night. The world heard him, and the world answered. And you should understand what that meant in that world. Song was not a pleasant addition to life, not background, not something to fill silence at a feast. Song was a force that could touch what hands could not. There are voices that persuade men, there are voices that persuade animals, and there are rarer voices, the kind the old world feared and honored, that persuade the very shape of things. Orpheus, they say, was that rare thing. He did not argue with nature. He did not demand. He played, and nature leaned in, as if the earth itself recognized a language older than words, older than names, older even than the thought that the world might not listen. Eurydice enters the story more quietly, and that is also part of its truth. The old tellings do not paint her long. They do not pause to describe her face or linger over the sound of her laughter. They do not try to make her remarkable in ways that distract from what happens next. They simply place her beside him, and in that placement, you are meant to feel something steady and complete. that a life can settle into itself without announcing that it has done so. She is called a nymph, which means she belongs to the living surface of the world. Green places, open air, water that reflects light. She belongs to the kind of days where death feels distant, almost theoretical. When I speak of their love, I do not need to invent scenes to prove it. The old voices make it clear in the way they say his name and hers together, as if the joining itself was enough. He loved her fiercely, and his happiness was simple. And because it was simple, it was also vulnerable. Their marriage stands there, briefly acknowledged, solid and unremarked, like a stone placed in the path before anyone knows it will be struck. The old voices rarely linger on joy. Joy does not resist time, it flows with it. It is loss that resists, loss that stops the breath and forces memory to slow down. And then the cut comes, sudden, unannounced, the way real cuts come. I have heard it told in slightly different shapes, passed through different mouths, softened here, sharpened there. But the ending is always the same. Not long after the wedding, Eurydice was in a green valley with other young nymphs, gathering spring flowers, bright things in her hands, the kind of small beauty people collect when they believe the world is safe. She moved through thick grass, laughing, careless in the way youth is careless, and she did not see what waited low and silent. A snake lay hidden there, warmed by sun, patient as stone. Her foot found it. The bite was quick. The poison did not negotiate. She cried out, one sharp sound that the old voices remember, and fell into the arms of her companions as they rushed to her. They say her face blanched, her eyes closed, the life leaving her with the terrible speed of venom. And then the valley filled with grief that did not belong to one throat only. The nymph's lament rose and carried, and the sound of it ran outward like a signal, like smoke, like wind. Orpheus heard it. That detail matters. He did not receive her death as news delivered calmly. He heard the mourning first, and the mourning pulled him toward the truth before he saw it. He ran, not as a hero entering battle, but as a husband rushing toward something he cannot bear. He reached the valley and found her there, cold already, the bright flowers still close by as if they had not understood they were in the wrong story. He looked down at the body of the one he had just begun to live with, and the world that used to move for his music did not move for him at all. Orpheus grieves, and the grief is not described like a lesson. It is described like weather. You can imagine it without effort, the same lyre in his hands, but the sound changed, the same mouth, but the song no longer meant to charm or gather. He sang among the living first, because that is what the living do when they still hope to be heard. He raised his voice under the sky where words return to you, where sound still has somewhere to go. He filled the fields and hills with her name until the name itself began to ache, until it felt worn thin by repetition, like a path walked too often. And the old voices insist on something you should not miss. Nature answered that lament too. The trees and rocks and rivers that had once followed his joy now seemed to share his sorrow. It is said that the whole world wept in its own way, as if his grief had become a season. And then, this is the hinge. Mourning was no longer enough. Something in him refused to accept the boundary, not because he believed the boundary unjust, and not because he imagined himself greater than it, but because grief had carried him as far as it could, and no farther. The silence left behind by Eurydice did not settle into meaning. It did not close. It waited. And in that waiting, a thought took shape, not sudden, not defiant, but steady and unavoidable. If the world had once answered his song, then perhaps even death could be asked to listen. So he does what the story is famous for, not as impulse, but as resolve, not in a dream, not as a ghost, not guided by visions or led by another hand. He goes while he is still alive, carrying only his lyre, because that is all he has ever truly carried across thresholds. The old voices name the descent through Tenorus, one of the mouths of the underworld. And when they name it, they mean the thing itself, a place where the earth opens into cold, where daylight thins and the air changes, where even confident men lower their voices without knowing why. You know the feeling, even if you have never stood at such an opening. The sense that sound is swallowed faster there, that your own footsteps belong less to you, that the world behind you already feels farther away than it should. Below is the realm the ancients describe with the same spare certainty again and again. No sun, no true sky, and crowds of the dead, shades, thin presences, not flesh as we know it, moving without urgency, without destination. The river Styx lies there as a boundary, dark and solemn, carrying oaths and endings alike. And when Orpheus first reached its bank, he did not find an empty shore. He found the press of souls, a crowding of shadows murmuring faintly, their sound not like speech, but like the rustle of leaves in a late autumn forest. That image stays because it is right. The dead gathered there as if waiting for passage, as if they had been waiting forever. In the distance came a sound that was not wind and not water, the rhythmic splash of oars. And then the boat approached, dark against darker water, guided by the ferryman who does not soften. Charon. Orpheus asked to be taken across. He begged, as any living man would beg at that threshold. But the answer was refusal, not argued, not explained, simply given. No. The dead have their roots, the living have theirs, and Charon's work is to keep that line clean. Orpheus heard only that hard denial again and again, until there was nothing left to say with words. And then he did what he had always done when words failed. He struck the strings. The gold-toned notes spread wide over the bank of Styx, and the sound reached even those who had forgotten how to listen. It reached Charon. The old voices remember him pausing, leaning on his oar, his sternness held still by something he could not deny. The boat took Orpheus in, not because the law had been rewritten, but because the law had been moved for a moment by music. And as the boat cut through the black water, the shadows followed along the bank and gathered behind him, drawn by the sound the way the living are drawn to fire. When he stepped onto the far side, he did not walk alone. He walked surrounded by the dead, with the music guiding him deeper toward the place where the rulers sit. There, too, a guardian waited, Cerberus, the three-headed hound, not as a spectacle, not as something to be defeated, but as a living lock placed upon a door that is not meant to swing easily. Orpheus did not fight. He did not threaten. He played. And Cerberus quieted, lowering its heads, the growl in its throats going still as if the sound had reminded it of sleep. And deeper still were those whose names are spoken, so you understand what kind of place this is. Not only a realm of shadows, but a realm where punishments are made into landscape. The thirst that never ends, the labor that never completes, the vessels that never fill. These are not named for decoration. They are named so you feel the scale of what is happening when Orpheus sings and, for a breath, the unending things pause. The wheel stills, the stone rests, the jar stops leaking. Even those who do not know pity are touched, the fierce ones, the ones who exist to punish without mercy. The old voices even remember tears where tears should not be. Not because the underworld has turned gentle, but because the song has reached a place where gentleness is not meant to survive. At last he stands before the rulers of that world, the king and queen of the dead, the ones who do not usually bend, because bending is what breaks the order of everything. Even here, the telling does not become loud. Orpheus does not boast, he does not accuse, he sings. He speaks of love as if it were a bond the underworld must recognize, because the underworld recognizes all bonds in the end. He speaks, too, of what is unavoidable, that all paths lead downward eventually, that Eurydice will belong to them no matter what. She has only arrived too soon. And he speaks the way a mortal must speak in that place, not as if asking for a miracle, but as if asking for a postponement. He reminds them that even they know what it is to have a wife taken and returned, to have a bond tested by separation. He does not ask to steal from death. He asks only that what was cut short be allowed briefly to finish. And the old story insists on this, softly but firmly. Even the hardest powers listen. Even the law of death can be made to pause, just long enough for terms to be spoken. The judgment is given like law, simple, absolute, without explanation. Eurydice may return. She may follow Orpheus upward, but he must not look back at her until they have both reached the upper world, until they stand fully in the light again. He must walk ahead. He must trust what he cannot see. Do you feel how cruelly precise that is? Not cruel in a loud way, cruel in a quiet way. The underworld does not forbid love. It forbids certainty. It says, you may have her, but only if you do not try to confirm her with your eyes, only if you do not reach for proof in the last stretch of darkness. No one explains why such a condition exists. It is simply placed there, the way the sea places a hidden stone beneath the surface and lets the swimmer discover it only after the water closes again. Orpheus agrees. What else can he do? He has already crossed the boundary that most humans do not cross. He has already won the thing no one expects to be won, an answer from the dead. Eurydice is restored to him in the only way the underworld restores anything, not as a gift you can hold freely, but as a permission with a thread tied to it. And so they begin the ascent. Orpheus in front, Eurydice behind, the space between them filled with silence, and the rule, that small rule, that single sentence, now heavier than all the stones that once moved for his music, heavier than the air itself, because it must be carried without hands. They began to climb, not with triumph, not with relief, not with any bright feeling you could hold on to. The underworld does not release its grip all at once. It loosens slowly, reluctantly, as if it wants you to feel every inch you have been allowed to take back. Orpheus stepped forward first because that was the law spoken to him, and Eurydice followed behind him because that was the law spoken over her as well. Between them, there was a narrow stretch of darkness, not a distance you could measure with the hand, but enough to unsettle the mind. He could not turn his head. He could not reach back and take her wrist. He could not even slow his pace to search for the shadow of her feet. He could only walk forward and carry the rule the way one carries a fragile vessel, careful not to tilt it. At first, the passage was tight, cut deep through stone that felt older than any human vow. The walls pressed close, not violently, but with the quiet pressure of something that is never needed to move aside. The air lay thick and cold, heavy in the chest, as if it had forgotten how wind behaves. The ground underfoot was uneven, not carved for comfort, not shaped for travelers, and when his sandal scraped, the sound did not travel, it fell away. In places the stone sweated, and the dampness clung to skin and cloth with a faint chill, as if the underworld did not want to let warmth pass through it. There were turns where the passage narrowed again, and the darkness seemed to thicken, as if the path itself tried to forget it was leading upward. Orpheus had entered the underworld with music, and music had moved what nothing else could move. But on this ascent, his lyre hung silent at his side. It was not forbidden, but it was useless. The bargain had been made. The rulers had spoken. Power had already done its work. What remained was endurance and the kind of restraint that feels like hunger. He kept his eyes forward, fixing them on the faintest change ahead, the suggestion that the darkness was not endless, the smallest thinning that makes you think of distance rather than depth. At times, the passage rose in short, irregular steps, as if the rock had been broken and rebroken by something older than tools. At times, it sloped in a long pull that made the thighs ache, slow enough that you could feel every breath, and yet never slow enough to feel safe. He told himself, again and again, that she was there. He told himself that this was the gift he had been granted, a return, but a return bound by terms. He reminded himself that the rulers of that place do not give with softness, that they give with conditions, because conditions are how the dead remain the dead, and the living remain living. And still, the human part of him began to reach for what it could not have. He began to count his steps, not to know where he was, but to steady himself. He began to listen, not with his ears alone, but with his whole body, straining for her breath, the brush of cloth, the smallest sign that would tell him she was real behind him, and not only a permission spoken once and already fading. The silence did not answer. That is what makes this ascent cruel. Not the steepness, not the darkness, but the removal of all ordinary signs so that love is not allowed proof. The dead do not breathe the way the living breathe. They do not shift their weight carelessly. They do not make small, comforting noises without meaning to. Eurydice, not yet fully returned, was like that, present and yet nearly soundless, moving under the same law that bound him. The old voices do not give her long speeches here. They do not let her reach forward and reassure him. They keep her quiet on purpose because the rule depends on that quiet. Orpheus is made to walk with nothing but trust, and trust becomes heavier when everything else has been taken away. The mind begins to invent sounds when it is starved of them. It begins to hear what it wants to hear, or what it fears. A drip of water becomes a footstep. A shift of air becomes a stumble. Even his own breathing can begin to feel like someone else's breath, and then suddenly not. And then the absence returns sharper than before. As they climbed, the air changed by degrees so small they could almost be imagined. It grew less dense, the pressure eased. The stone walls drew back slightly, no longer pressing so close to the shoulders. The passage widened and the ceiling lifted, and in that widening there was a new kind of unease, because closeness at least tells you where you are. Space gives the mind room to roam. Orpheus could sense, without seeing, that they were nearing a threshold, because the darkness was no longer uniform. It began to have a direction. Ahead there was a difference, a faint suggestion of gray, like the first paling of dawn behind cloud. The ground under his feet grew drier. The air carried, now and then, the ghost of something that belonged to the upper world, not scent exactly, but the memory of scent, a thin hint that the air above was not stagnant. The old tellers understood well the danger of nearing the end. Deep in darkness, patience is possible. You tell yourself there is time, because there is no sign of release. But when the dark begins to thin, when you sense the world above drawing near, the mind grows restless. Hope comes close enough to touch, and suddenly you are terrified of losing it. Orpheus felt it then, that tightening behind the ribs, the ache that comes when something precious rests just beyond your grasp, and you know how easily it could be taken away. He no longer feared that the path would never end. He feared that it would end wrongly. He feared that he had misunderstood some small edge of the condition, some invisible line that could be crossed too early by the simplest human motion. He feared that the permission could be withdrawn at any moment, quietly, without announcement, the way a flame goes out when the wick finally gives up. He had walked into the realm of death and returned with a rule to obey, and now every step felt like walking along a narrow ledge where the slightest misstep would undo everything. The cruelty was not that the underworld demanded obedience. The cruelty was that it demanded obedience at the one point where the human heart is least able to bear uncertainty, at the point where you can almost taste the world again. There are tellings where he hears something behind him, a faint stumble, a soft disturbance of air, the barest whisper of movement against stone. It is never described as dramatic, only enough to remind him that she is still fragile, still not entirely part of the world of breath and light. Whether the sound was real or born of fear hardly matters. It did its work. It reminded him that Eurydice was not yet safe, that she still belonged, by law, by order, by the old arrangement of things, to the darkness until the darkness released her. He kept walking. He did not turn. Not yet. But you can feel the thought beginning to form, the way a crack forms in ice long before it breaks. What if she is not there? What if the underworld has already taken her back, quietly, without telling him? What if he reaches the light and discovers that he has been walking alone, carrying nothing but hope shaped like a memory? What if the rule itself is not a kindness, but a trap, a condition chosen because it is aimed directly at the human heart, at the need to see, to confirm, to make the unseen visible? These thoughts do not arrive as clear sentences. They arrive as sensation, a hollowing in the stomach, heat behind the eyes, a sudden need to stop and listen. Orpheus listened until his body ached with it, until the silence itself seemed to hum. And the closer he came to the upper air, the more unbearable that silence became, because now the world above was close enough to imagine clearly. Sunlight, wind, birds, leaves stirred by ordinary breezes, and yet behind him there was still only that thin, uncertain absence. The gray ahead grew brighter, and with it came a strange reversal. The closer he came to freedom, the more trapped he felt. Down below, the underworld had been absolute. You knew where you stood. Here, near the threshold, everything was in between. The mind hates the in-between. It claws at it. Ahead, the path brightened, not bright like day, but bright like the promise of day, a loosening, a sense that stone was no longer swallowing all light. The air turned colder in a different way, not the buried cold of depths, but the clean cold that belongs to open space. Orpheus could almost hear, or thought he could almost hear, the upper world beginning again. A faint rush that might have been wind and grass or might have been nothing at all. The old voices say this is where fear overcame him, not because he forgot what he had been told, but because he remembered it too well. He remembered that the condition was absolute. He remembered that safety was defined by a boundary he could not see. He remembered that Eurydice belonged to the underworld until the law released her, and that the law cared nothing for longing. He was almost there, and that nearness sharpened everything into one unbearable point. And so he did what countless careful people do when relief is within reach. He reached for certainty. Orpheus turned his head. It was a small motion, ordinary, the kind you make without thinking when you want to be sure someone is still beside you. But here it was, the forbidden thing, the one act the underworld had named. He turned, and for a single instant he saw her, Eurydice behind him, close enough that love could almost pretend the rule had never existed. Her face was there, her eyes met his. In that brief moment she was not a shadow, not a promise, not a memory. She was herself, caught between worlds, balanced on the edge of return. And there is a detail the old story holds tightly, even when it does not dress it in long description. She was not yet fully of the upper world. She was there, and yet still touched by that other air. Her presence was like a candle flame seen through thin cloth, visible, real, and yet not something you could grasp without smothering it. The very fact that he could see her was the sign that he had looked too soon. And then the loss happened the way the underworld does things, quietly, efficiently, without display. She began to slip back, not falling, not dragged, not seized by visible hands, simply receding as if the darkness had remembered her name and spoken it aloud. Orpheus reached for her because of course he did. The story does not blame him for that. It only states what followed. His hand closed on air, and her fingers were already beyond his grasp. In the old telling, her last words are few. Not a speech, not a dramatic curse, only the barest human sound of confusion and pain. She asks why. She names love as the cause. She says farewell as someone says it when it is too late to bargain. And then her voice fades, her form thins, the space between them fills again with shadow, and the underworld closes over her the way water closes after a stone has passed through it. The brightness ahead remains, indifferent. The threshold does not darken in sympathy. The law has been satisfied, and the underworld does not explain itself twice. Orpheus rushed back down the path, as if speed could undo the law. He begged, he cried out, he played, he did everything a man does when he refuses to accept the second loss. He called her name into the dark until the name felt raw in his mouth. But the underworld does not bend twice for the same voice. Charon would not ferry him again. The gate did not open. The law had been broken, and that was enough. The permission was gone. It is important that nothing heroic happens here. No second miracle, no hidden clause. Only the terrible plainness of consequence. Orpheus had been given a single thread to hold, and the moment he clenched his hand around it, it snapped. So he came back to the upper world alone. And that is a particular kind of agony, to have daylight again, air again, the ordinary world restored, while the one thing you cross death for is missing. The first breath of open air should have been salvation. Instead, it felt like betrayal. The wind touched his face and did not comfort him. The light fell on his hands and made them look strange, as if they belonged to someone who had not just reached into shadow. The sound of the living world returned. Birds, distant water, the small noises that fill day, and those sounds did not heal him. They made the loss sharper because they proved the world could continue without her. He stood in some tellings at the mouth of the descent for a long time, looking at nothing, because there was nothing left to look at that could change what had been done. He walked finally, but the walking had no direction. Everywhere was the upper world. Everywhere was the place she should have been. Orpheus carried his lyre in hands that no longer knew what to ask of it. Music had won him an audience in the underworld and still could not keep what he loved. Imagine what that does to a man whose whole life has been built on the belief that sound can reach what hands cannot. He sang again because he could not stop being who he was, but the songs turned inward. They no longer called trees to follow. They no longer soothed beasts. They named absence. They circled the same wound again and again, as if circling could somehow change the shape of it. The old voices remembered that he turned away from the love of women afterward, refusing what remained. Some say he would not touch another wife, because he could not bear another beginning that might end the same way. Some say he chose the company of boys and men instead. The tradition holds these details without apology, the way it holds storms and seasons, as facts remembered, not explained. And the world, unable to leave him in peace, gave him an ending as harsh as his life had become. In the end, remembered by the old voices, his death came violently, his body torn apart by those who could not endure his sorrow or his refusal. Yet even then, the story clings to its last image, his head and his lyre drifting down the river, still singing, the song not ending with the body. The river carries him as rivers carry all things, and the song continues because song, in the old imagination, is one of the few forces that can outlast flesh. And below, in the place where all journeys end, Eurydice was there. In some tellings, at last they walked together again among the dead, where no rule was needed because no threshold remained, no light to reach for, no test shaped around a human weakness, only the dim steadiness of the underworld, where he could look at her as long as he wished, and it would change nothing. There is no triumph in that reunion. There is no bright closure. There is only the quiet fact that what could not be held in the upper world can, at last, be endured in the lower one. where nothing is taken away by surprise because everything has already been taken. This is how the story is remembered, not as a triumph and not as a warning, but as a measure of how little separates holding from losing. Orpheus was allowed to go farther than any living man, and he failed by no great act, only by a human one. The gods did not strike him down, and the underworld did not deceive him. A rule was given, and it was broken at the one moment when it mattered most. That is why the story remained, not because of the descent, or the song, or the miracle, but because of the turning, small enough to feel familiar, and heavy enough to carry the rest of a life.